Eddie, I'm wishing that David Jolly was still in that body right about now. I want to be really specific for our viewers, so let me put up what these voter suppression laws disguised as election security would do. Many of them put restrictions on mail-in voting. Now, I'm old enough to remember when Republicans relied on mail-in voting. So this is a new sort of Republican behavior that they want to cleave out mail-in voting because it's too easy. They feel like they lose there too. They want to create barriers for all that kind of non-in-person voting. They want to expand voter roll purges. We should explain what this is. It's just people that moved, in very, very, very few instances, people that have died. They don't vote anyway. This is just an aggressive move to, I think, put fear in the mind. And it goes in the category of sowing distrust in election results. Some of the other ones are about limiting voter registration opportunities. What Republicans don't like, if we're being really blunt, they don't like people being allowed to register on same day. This really disproportionately hurts people who are transient, college students who tend, you guessed it, not to vote Republican. They also want to implement stricter voting ID laws. Now, there is a pretty marketable argument. They say things like, well, to go to they used to say, to go to Blockbuster, I need an ID. Why not to vote? But again, this has a disproportionate impact on people who don't have driver's licenses or IDs. So there is no fair read of these moves as anything other than voter suppression of the kinds of voters that Republicans have given up on.
Absolutely. And I think this is why Senator Warnock and others have been pairing H.R. 1 with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, right? That those two must be seen as part and as one of the same, right? Or at least two pieces of the puzzle to address what David just laid out. The Congress has to respond to the gutting of the Civil Rights Act, and we have to address the broader concerns that are laid out in H.R. 1. But let's be very clear, Nicole. What we're witnessing here is an extension of what we saw on January 6th. January 6th was the spectacle. Folk storming the Capitol, leaving feces over the threatening the lives of folk in the name of what? The big lie. In the name of this idea that the election was stolen. In the name that the election was stolen by those people who lived in Atlanta, who lived in Philadelphia, who lived in Milwaukee. We know exactly what they were doing. Right? We know exactly what they were arguing for, that this country must be in some ways a country that must remain white in the vein of old Europe. And then this is an extension of that, right? We don't have to sack the Capitol. We just simply have to pass laws to disenfranchise, to suppress the votes of those folk who we think ought to just simply shut up and be grateful. We need to understand this for what it is. It's an extension of the seditionists. It's an extension of the insurrection. It's undemocratic at its core, Nicole.
Let me show all of you what Stacey Abrams had to say on this. I believe this is from last night, about the importance of not abandoning this story and these efforts by Republicans. Let's watch.
Politics is about self-preservation, and it's about creating the world you want to see. If we don't elect people who see us in that world, then we should not be surprised that they try to draw us out of the narrative. That's why constant attention and agitation is so necessary, because there isn't this thing where it's just about us. It's about everyone. And people have different needs. They have different wants. They have different notions of power. Agitation is how we make certain that our needs get included in this larger narrative.
I love the word there, Don Edwards, agitation. It's a very natural extension of good trouble. And I wonder what you make of her role of just keeping this front and center.
Well, I think that she's right to do that. And I mean, after all, look at what is happening in her own home state of Georgia, where if you don't keep up the agitation, no one hears it, the rules are changed, and the next thing you know, we're behind the eight ball once again. I mean, the fact of the matter is that still over 3/4 of the Congress are white men. And so it's not as though the rules have changed so much that it allows for a more expansive view of who represents us in the Congress. And so I think that, looking at what the rules changes would be under H.R. 1, it's all about opening up democracy. And if Republicans are going to stand against opening up democracy, we should continue to agitate, advocate, and communicate in a way that allows us to change the rules so that more of us, not fewer of us, have the ability to participate. And the outside groups have to keep this up because otherwise it'll just slip to another, check mark or hashtag.
Hey, thanks for watching our YouTube channel. You should know that you can follow today's top stories and breaking news and catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.